I did not witness these paranormal events, though I had to manage the consequences and the interventions associated with them. About 15 years ago, I was the factory manager for a biscuit manufacturer in Adelaide, South Australia. We employed about 350 people and ran a 24 hours per 7-day operation. The factory, in parts, dated back to the 1950s, with part of the facility being housed in old aircraft hangars. There was some equipment in use of a similar vintage, often alongside state-of-the-art automation and robotics. The flow of ingredients and biscuits through the plant followed a U-shaped path, with the area in the middle of the U housing a range of smaller, standalone processes and material and inventory stores. On night shift, we primarily only operated the main production lines, and the stores and minor processes in the middle of the plant were rarely occupied, except for the occasional team member having to start in the early hours of the morning to set up or prepare equipment or ingredients ready for day shift. It was one of these early starters who popped her head into my office mid-morning one day asking if I had time to talk. I did, and she grabbed a seat and began to tell me about St. David Smith, name changed, outside the chocolate manufacturing plant at about 4 a.m. that morning. I had heard about David, but never met him, as he had passed away some 18 months before I started working at this manufacturing plant. I had been there for about 4 years. She told me that as she came out of the raw materials store, she saw David sitting on a dwarf wall in the central corridor some 5 meters in front of her. Before jumping down off the wall and walking away from her, she clearly saw his face. She told me his face was unmistakable. He was dressed in long white pants and a white jumper, standard bakery issue. The thing was that we had dispensed with all white pants as it was cheaper to rent blue pants from our laundry service provider, but David wasn't to know that. This change occurred 2 years prior to this event, but some years after David's death. She wasn't at all scared, as she had heard tales about David making appearances in this same area when there were few team members about. In fact, she tried to catch up with him. However, she told me, no matter how fast she walked, she was unable to close that 5-meter gap between them. This corridor was about 40 meters long, and the end of it opened up into a large processing hall. Before reaching the end, she stupidly called out to him, her words. You will understand why shortly, but he didn't respond. He turned right at the end, with the next doorway or bit of equipment to potentially hide behind some 15 meters away. There was no sign of him once she reached the corner. I was a natural skeptic in regards to all things supernatural back then, but this young lady's story was authentic, and I had no reason to think she was fabricating it for my benefit. I asked her how she felt about David's presence, and she was fine. She did share with me that some team members, those that didn't know David and had only heard about these sightings, were scared of walking through this area. I felt compelled to follow this up, so I asked her to do me a favor. I got her to compile a list of people she knew that like her had seen David, and over the course of the next few days asked them if they were okay chatting to me about their experiences. She was aware of some 10 or so employees that had seen David, and 7 of those people were willing to talk to me about what they had seen. With people dotted across our 4 shifts, people worked 12-hour shifts, 4 on, 4 off, 3 on, 3 off. It took me about a week to catch up with them all. There was 3 people who knew David quite closely and who were often on night shift that had seen him on 3 or more occasions. The rest had 1 or 2 encounters. They were all similar experiences. David appeared quite solid and was dressed in whites. He wouldn't interact in any way, but would walk out of sight, and occasionally walk through walls or simply fade from view quickly. There was a mixed response from these people emotionally, from enjoying having an old mate drop by to see them, to concern bordering on fear. I also found out as much as I could about David. He had passed away aged in his early 40s, whilst playing squash with a work colleague after work. David was deaf from birth and unable to speak clearly. He had learning difficulties also, and was adopted at a very young age. He commenced work for this company in his mid-teens, and it had been a job for life. He was a competent employer across a number of lower-skilled roles, but very highly valued for his commitment and work ethic. David and a number of his colleagues were adept at sign language. His job meant everything to him. He had a small but close group of friends, primarily from within his adopted family and workmates. I asked my managers and supervisors to gauge the broader view of the workforce, and whilst not widely known, those that had heard about David's appearances, on balance, were uncomfortable about it. This feedback compelled me to take action. This meant I had to completely suspend any disbelief, which wasn't too hard to do. I also had to confer with our regional head of manufacturing and HR. The company was part of a large US-based multinational food company, and I needed to get expert help. When things like this happen, who are you going to call? Sure enough, a quick web search for Adelaide paranormal investigators gave me 3 leads. I made 3 calls and phone interviewed them all, arriving at a preferred service provider who was invited in to meet with me and my HR manager. They laid out a broad plan that we massaged until everyone was confident we had a sensitive but robust approach. They spoke to 5 of the 7 people I had spoken to get additional information and conferred with our position that, for the well-being of the broader workforce, an intervention was required. The PSI group got unrestricted access to our plan on a night when we were observing a public holiday. The only other person on site was our security guard. They set up audio, video, and electromagnetic sensors and recorders, but alas, no David appearances occurred. I suspect David knew it was Anzac Day and attended the dawn service and RSL club instead of work that day. A week later we had another public holiday for Easter, so the PSI guys were back, sans machines. They brought along instead a medium they used on occasion, who was able to sense David's presence, but didn't see him or hear him. However, the medium was confident that David acknowledged the words and the ritual explaining that he needed to leave his work, his friends, and this place behind, and start a new life and adventure by finding the light and walking towards it with great joy and anticipation. We didn't tell our workforce what had been done, only that we believed that we had encouraged David to move on. We did ask the workforce to let us know if we had not been successful, and in the further 6 months I was at the Adelaide plant, and some further follow-up in the 18 months I worked for the company interstate, there were no reports of David and his baker's wives attending work.